Today, I'll be talking about improving speech intelligibility through speaker-dependent and independent spectral style conversion. Speech is important for human communication. We refer to typical way of speaking is habitual speech. The problem is that habitual speech becomes less intelligible in noise, and habitual speech is also hard to understand for people with hearing impairments and non-native speakers. These figures shows two scenarios of unintelligible speech. Current speaking devices, which create synthetic speech similar to habitual speech, can also be difficult to understand in noise. In the second figure, atypical speakers, such as people with dysarthria, is also hard to understand. To make noisy speech become more intelligible, one can apply listener-side solutions, such as noise suppression and cancellation. The methods require noise cancellation devices, which takes as input noisy signal and outputs enhanced signal with higher intelligibility and quality. There are many cases where listeners don't have noise cancellation devices, such as genset announcements. Due to the limitation of listener-side solution, let's look at how speakers adjust their voice to make it more intelligible. Like in a classroom, teachers speak louder and slower to help students understand better. They can adopt a special, clear speaking style to make their habitual speech more resilient to noisy environments and listener deficits. Researchers show that clear speech features extended phoneme duration, longer and more frequent pauses. Clear speech is more intelligible than habitual speech. Spectral and duration factors are probably significant for improved intelligibility of clear speech. To make habitual speech more intelligible in noise, we can apply speaker-side solutions. This approach converts speech directly from speakers into clear speech prior to its distortion due to background noise. This approach does not require noise cancellation devices. The figures show two applications of speaker-side solutions. In a scenario, habitual speech from synthesizer is modified to become more resilient to noisy environment. In another scenario, we build devices that make atypical speech more intelligible in noise. There are several studies on speaker-side solution. Researchers apply filters to habitual speech to create characteristics of clear speech. They improve the intelligibility of typical speakers, but the approach had trade-off between naturalness and intelligibility because such modification is impossible for humans. And they don't have the modeling of habitual to clear conversion. My colleague, Hami, modeled the habitual to clear conversion on vowels using Gaussian mixture model. For atypical speakers, my advisor, Alex, converted dysarthric speech into typical speech using the GMM. These machine learning-based methods such as DNN, shows the most promising results, but there's still room for improvement. So the goal of this study is to improve speech intelligibility of typical and atypical speakers automatically by learning how they map their voice and make it more intelligible. In this section, we explain basic concept of voice and style conversion and summarize our previous results on spectral style conversion. Voice conversion is a process of transforming a source speaker's speech to sound like a target speaker's speech. The figure shows a typical voice conversion framework. There are two phases, training and conversion. During the training phase, one can prepare parallel utterances that contain utterances from source and target speaker with the same words. In speech analysis, one can extract speech features such as fundamental frequency F0 and spectrogram using a vocoder, then further analyze speech features into mapping features. In time alignment, mapping features of source speakers is time warped to those of target speaker. And finally, one can train frame by frame mapping functions using the align mapping features, which is related to our goal. During conversion, one first analyzed mapping features of input speech from source speaker. Then one applies mapping functions on the features to obtain modified features. And finally, one synthesized speech from modified features using a vocoder. Differently, style conversion learn how to map one speaking style to another speaking style of the same speaker. One can use voice conversion framework and voice conversion mapping techniques for style conversion. For example, GMM were used to map habitual to clear vowels, but got modest result. Previously, we used a database of 3 speakers, one female with Parkinson, one male with Parkinson, and atypical speakers. Each reached 25 Harvard sentences in habitual and clear style. For each speaker, we map habitual to clear speech. Firstly, we use a pre-trained variational autoencoder to encode 40-dimensional male capstone into 12-dimensional mapping features called VAE12. And secondly, we apply the DNN mappings for style conversion. A variational autoencoder has encoder and decoder. An encoder receives as input 39 male capstone coefficients and predict the 12-dimensional mean and variance of a normal distributions of latent variables. From the normal distribution, we sample random latent variables, and the decoder reconstruct the input male capstone coefficient from the latent variables. We use the means as the mapping features for style conversion, and a spectrogram is encoded frame by frame. For mapping, we take habitual capstone, get the mapping feature using the encoder, then map these habitual features to clear features. Finally, we reconstruct the clear capstone using the decoder. The DNA mapping significantly increased the intelligibility of habitual speech from 24% to 46% for one male speaker with Parkinson. The result shows potential of mapping features, but DNA mapping may be too simplistic, which is what we address next. In our previous work, our spectral mapping only improved one speaker. So in this section, I present methods to better train spectral mapping. The goal is to improve the performance of habitual to clear spectral mappings for style conversion. So we utilize the conditional generative adversarial nets or SIGANs to map the spectral features of habitual speech to those of clear speech. We examine the performance of SIGANs in one-to-one mapping and many-to-one mapping. Traditional GAN has a generator, G, and a discriminator, D. The G generates an image, and D decides if an image is generated or real. S either gets better, so does the other. The D is only used during training. And the application of GAN can be data augmentation, face etching, and super resolution image. The conditional GAN or SIGANs is the GAN conditioned on auxiliary data. In our case, G takes as input the habitual spectrum and generate the clear spectrum. D discriminates between generated and real clear spectrum. The real clear spectrum and the habitual spectrum are from the same speakers and sentence. The real clear spectrum is time warped to the habitual spectrum. The D is also conditioned on habitual spectrum to learn if the generated clear spectrum is good transformation from a given habitual spectrum. By including D, we learn better loss function for training G. The structure of GAN is the same as the DNA mapping in previous works, and we want to train the network in a better way. We are going to use the SIGANs in two ways. The first way is one-to-one mapping, and the goal is to improve the performance of style conversion from previous work. We train SIGAN for each speaker for mapping habitual to clear spectrum. During conversion, we apply the speaker-specific mapping for the same speakers. The output is habitual speech plus the modified spectrum. We evaluate the log spectral distortion of converted spectrum from two mapping methods. The log spectral distortion is a root mean square difference between converted spectrum and target clear spectrum. According to the table, the SIGAN spray mapping has lower distortion than DNA mappings, which shows potential of using secants. To illustrate the thing that long spectral distortion can find, look at the figures. From top to bottom, we have spectrogram of source, habitual speech, DNN mapping, secant mapping, and target clear spectrogram. Look at the red box. The secant spectrum looks more similar to the target clear spectrum. Even though we get good results with log spectral distortion, the log spectral distortion is a rough predictor for human perception. So we conduct the keyword recall test with 60 participants listening and transcribing 25 Harvard sentences. The secant mapping outperformed the DNN's mapping. And the secant mapping significantly improve the speech intelligibility of habitual speech for two speakers. One male speaker with Parkinson and one male typical speakers. A disadvantage of one-to-one mapping as it requires speaker-specific training data. So it's difficult to apply to new speakers in real-life application. In many-to-one mapping, we pick to target speakers with the best sentence level intelligibility, one male and one female, and both happens to be typical speakers. And we map habitual speech of multiple speakers to these targets. And we use all the speakers except the 3 speakers for testing and 2 target speakers as training source speakers. Thus, we use several typical and atypical speakers. During conversion, we apply the mapping on test speakers, which is not in the training data. So we evaluate the proposed method using keyword recall test with 44 participants. And the many-to-one method significantly increased the intelligibility of habitual speech for one speaker. The result is promising, but not as good as one-to-one. In this research, we propose a spectral style mapping using the secants for improving speech intelligibility. For one-to-one mapping, the secants outperformed the DNN and significantly increased the intelligibility for 2 speakers, a typical speaker and one with Parkinson. For many-to-one mappings, the secant significantly increased the intelligibility for speaker with Parkinson. Thanks for your attention.